Hello again. We're once again sitting comfortably for another lecture about the history of the Church of England. I hope you found the last video helpful. Hopefully you'll find this one interesting too, and if it's not interesting to you, you can go and watch videos of cats looking very cute. So where did we get to? In the last video, we got to James the First and talked a bit about what happened in his reign, and we'll be moving on to the rest of the Stuarts, and of course talking about the English Civil War, a very important event. This is, of course, an informal lecture, and I've probably glossed over a lot of things. One of the things I might have mentioned in the last video was Richard Hooker, who was an Anglican theologian during the reign of Elizabeth. He's quite an important one. Richard Hooker, he was kind of in the middle ground of the Church of England. He wasn't a Puritan, but on the other hand, he wasn't necessarily a very traditionalist high churchman. But he was very important in defending the ethos of the Church of England and its formal structures. Richard Hooker wrote a book called The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, a rather dry-sounding title. But his book defended the structure and the organisation of the Church of England. Now, he was quite influenced by the ancient theologian Pseudo-Dionysius, an anonymous writer who was writing under the name of Dionysius the Areopagite from the New Testament in the 7th century, I think. So Pseudo-Dionysius had talked about the celestial hierarchy, the orders of the angels, the thrones, dominions, principalities, powers, and all that lot. And Richard Hooker was very much on board with the idea of there being an hierarchy among the angels. And he thought that just as there must be a hierarchy of the angelic beings in heaven, there must also be a hierarchy on earth within the church. And on that basis, he defended the traditional orders of deacon, priest, and bishop, and felt that was essential to the church and the running of things. But although he believed in hierarchy, there was also a democratic element in Richard Hooker's thinking, because he defended the authority of Parliament over the church. So he didn't simply defend the authority of the king as the high churchmen and the traditionalists in the Church of England did, but he also defended the necessity of parliamentary control over the church. So Richard Hooker, a hugely important theologian for Anglicans. But one of the interesting things about Richard Hooker is, although he did serve as a cathedral dean, a large portion of his life was spent as a country clergyman, as a country parson. And this is one of the interesting things within the Church of England, that you had somebody off in the countryside, in some village in the middle of nowhere, writing this incredibly important theology. When we get to the 19th century, we'll talk about John Keble, who didn't even hold a position like cathedral dean as Richard Hooker did. John Keble spent his entire career as a country priest, as a vicar in the countryside. And this is a particular characteristic of the Church of England. It has a very kind of rustic, very rural flavour. The Church of England, the heart of the Church of England is the country parish, the village church. Although we've got the great cathedrals in the cities, that's not really where the essence or the heart of the Church of England is. The Church of England, compared to other Christian denominations, is very much grounded in the English countryside, in its ethos. So Richard Hooker, that's somebody that you probably ought to know about, and I didn't mention him in the previous video. But anyway, we've got past Elizabeth and we're on the Stuarts now. So the Stuart dynasty, who replaced the Tudor dynasty under James I, who was, as I mentioned, a descendant of Henry VII via Mary Queen of Scots, his granddaughter. People know the Tudors very well. They know about Henry VIII, and they know about Queen Elizabeth I. They often say that the reign of Queen Elizabeth I was a golden age, which I kind of disagree with. So the Stuarts they're kind of glossed over. So a lot of kids learn about them in history lessons at school, but they don't remember them. They only remember Henry VIII and maybe the Spanish Armada. But as the Stuart period, it was an important period. There are some dark things that happened during this time. There was, of course, the English Civil War, a really terrible and tragic chapter in English history. But there were also times of peace under King James I and under King Charles II. You had periods when England wasn't constantly at war with her European neighbours. A lot of great stuff happened as well. As well, pardon me. You had, under the Stuarts, you had some of Shakespeare's best-known plays, like Macbeth and Hamlet. Those were written during the reign of James I. Francis Bacon, the great scientific thinker. Under Charles II, you had the Royal Society being founded and advances in science. There are changes in culture. So the Stuart era, although there was a lot of tension and a lot of arguing and fighting, of rivalry between king and parliament, and the ongoing religious disputes that had been inherited from the Tudors by the Stuarts, it was also a time of progress and modernisation in many respects. So don't neglect the Stuarts. Don't go thinking that English history is all about the Tudors. Okay? So, James I dies, and the throne goes to his son Charles I. So, Charles I, he was married to Henrietta Maria, who was a French princess, who was a Catholic, and she brought her own priest with her. And she went on a barefoot pilgrimage to Walsingham, doing lots of Catholic things, which angered a lot of people. Britain was a firmly Protestant country at the time of King Charles I. So this French Catholic queen coming over and going on barefoot pilgrimages, that wasn't going to go down terribly well with a lot of people. And it increased the resentment that the Puritans had over the Church of England and King Charles I, and the fear of popery coming back. The Puritans were as angry as ever, and then they wanted change, and they weren't satisfied that the Church of England was going in the direction they wanted, especially not with the growing importance of the anti-Puritan party. I mentioned in the previous video, sometimes they're called Arminians because of the theology of free will that was advocated by Jacob Arminius, which I identified with, though that's possibly not the best description of them. They might be called high church men, although that word didn't really come into use until a later period, towards the end of the 17th century. These high church men, or Arminians, were very much traditionalists. They wanted to prevent change in the church in a more radically Protestant direction as the Puritans wanted. They looked back to the early church fathers as their inspiration before the Middle Ages, before the time of Catholicism. They thought, well, the time of the church fathers was a good time when you had a united church under bishops, following the ancient traditions of the church, but without all of the weird stuff that came in the Middle Ages, like indulgences at the Catholic Church, which the Protestants didn't particularly like. One of the important people amongst this anti-Puritan party was a man called Lancelot Andrewes, who wrote a book of devotions, private devotions and prayers for people to say, and he offered a source of spirituality that was very much grounded in the early church period, the church fathers. He was a Protestant. He didn't go along with Catholicism, but you can find maybe more of a Catholic spirit in his thinking. And Lancelot Andrewes was hugely important in the 19th century with the emergence of Anglo-Catholicism and the Oxford movement, which we'll talk about. I'm not sure if we'll necessarily have time in this video to talk about those developments in the 19th century, but Lancelot Andrewes of the 17th century High Church party, he was very much part of that. We sometimes call this particular party, the anti-Puritan party, the Caroline Divines. A group, they because of being in the era of Charles I, and some of them continue into the era of Charles II too, some of the later Caroline Divines. I recently read in the last year a book by J.I. Packer. In fact, it was his last book before he died. It was published after his death, The Heritage of Anglican Theology. And although obviously J.I. Packer was an evangelical and very reformed, he had nice things to say about all the different movements and periods in the church. He tries to put everything in the best light. And he said of the Caroline Divines that their approach was that what you need to get right is the right way to pray, the right way to worship, the right way to behave. Once you do those things, that will lead you to getting right with God and having a right relationship with God. So what we need in the church is order, to follow the correct traditions, to behave the right way in church. And J.I. Packer felt that that's a commendable approach, but it's not quite right. He'd say what you need to do is first to be converted, to get into that right relationship with God. And then once you're in that position, then the rest of the stuff, like praying correctly, going to church, having order in the church and doing things the right way, that will slot into place once you're actually right with God and you've got that basic bit right. So a bit of a difference in thinking. Do we focus on the right order in the church, or do we focus on that personal conversion, which is kind of what the Puritans were very much into? One of the most important people amongst these Caroline Divines, or the anti-Puritan party, was a man called William Laud, who was a favourite of Charles I, and he became Archbishop of Canterbury. And he was a very... if we want to be negative about him, we might say he was quite an antagonistic chap. He was not prepared to make compromises with the Puritans. He felt that we need to come down hard on these people who weren't going along with how the church was supposed to be run. And he imposed some quite harsh punishments on people who didn't toe the line and follow the correct rules of wearing the right dress during church services, using the Book of Common Prayer, the liturgy of the church correctly. And so, again, because he was taking the fight to the Puritans, that got their backs up, which is one of the things that led to the eventual English Civil War. King Charles I. So, what can we say about him? So we've mentioned his wife. He very much favoured that Arminian high church party within the Church of England. He was very hostile to Calvinism, which meant he was very much against the Puritans. And he has also had something of an autocratic streak. So he believed that in the divine right of kings, that the king is appointed by God, and the buck stops with him. He was solely responsible for making sure things went right in the country, that he had absolute power, which didn't sit well with the role of Parliament. During the Tudor period, the king and Parliament had largely got along quite well, and there was a kind of harmony between the monarchic power of the crown and the authority invested in Parliament. But King Charles I didn't like Parliament. The majority of people within Parliament supported the Puritans, and they wanted change in the church. They didn't like the high church stuff that King Charles favoured. And Charles I tended to have favourites. For instance, we've mentioned William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a favourite of King Charles. Also, there's a chap called the Duke of Buckingham, who was given a lot of power and importance, and Parliament resented that. They wanted to get rid of this chap, the Duke of Buckingham. Eventually, there's a famous incident where King Charles I went to Parliament to arrest some people who his opponents, and he famously burst into the Parliament chamber and they weren't there and said, "My birds have flown." And because of that, the monarch is not allowed to go into the House of Commons. I don't know if you've ever seen the state opening of Parliament. If you want to learn more about Britain and England, you really should watch on YouTube a video of the state opening of Parliament. One of the things that happens there is Black Rod, who is the representative of the monarch, or the king or the queen, he goes and he knocks on the door of the Parliament chamber, and he's refused admittance every time, just to keep knocking on the door because of that incident of the king bursting into Parliament. And because of this great increasing tension between king and Parliament, the king decides, well, do I really need these Parliament? Why don't I just get rid of them and I'll just be the absolute monarch, and everybody will do what I say. Of course, the problem is that the king doesn't have the authority invested in law to raise taxes. So King Charles does the best he can to manage without taxes. He sells off titles to raise money. He issues fines to people for various things that aren't according to law, and he raises ship money. So he had the right to raise money to fund the navy. Which, of course, he wasn't actually using that ship money that way, but it was a useful way to to raise taxes without Parliament. And he managed for a while. This was working perfectly fine until King Charles decided that because he was King of Scotland as well as England, that he decided to impose the Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican liturgy, on the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. He wanted to turn the Church of Scotland into an Anglican church like the Church of England. So he passed declared that he decided to, so he required all the churches in Scotland to use a Book of Common Prayer. There's a famous incident, probably legendary, of a woman called Jenny Geddes in Scotland, who, according to legend, she was outraged when she heard the Book of Common Prayer being used in her Scottish church, and she said, "Dost thou say a mass in my lug?" Obviously the Scottish accent, and she's said to have thrown her stool at the minister because of her anger at this. And most of the Scottish people weren't happy. They supported Calvinism, they supported the Presbyterian, the Reformed way of doing things, and they didn't want to be turned into the Church of England in Scotland. And there was a war, and unfortunately Charles I didn't have the power or the money to be able to fight this, because he got rid of Parliament and he couldn't raise any taxes. Eventually all these tensions came to a head, and there was a civil war. And part of the country favoured the king and part of the country favoured Parliament. Most of the landowners and nobility supported the king, but some of the nobility and landowners supported Parliament. Oftentimes the villagers would go along with whatever the local gentry favoured, and sometimes you'd have one village supporting the king and another village just down the road supporting Parliament. Most of the coastal towns, they supported Parliament, most of them, which meant that the Parliament had the navy, which meant they could send off ships and get supplies, which the king wasn't able to do. London, where all the trade was done, that supported Parliament. The capital for the king was Oxford. That was his stronghold. And this war went on for years, and it absolutely devastated the country. Of course, on the other side of the channel, you had the 30 Years' War going on, which was a similar struggle, different in some ways, it involved various countries, and they were all battling it out over religion and dynastic power. So some of the same issues of Protestant versus Catholic, emperor versus city-state. Some of these things were going on over on the continent at the same time that the English were beating each other up over this dispute between king and parliament. Scotland, of course, King Charles was a Scottish king, and at times the Scots were inclined to favour the king, but they were Presbyterian, and they resented the fact that he tried to impose Anglicanism on them, the Book of Common Prayer. They wanted their Presbyterian church, and when King Charles I fled to Scotland after he was starting to lose, he was taken prisoner by the Scots, and they tried to force him to make the Church of England into a Presbyterian church, and that didn't seem likely to happen. So eventually, King Charles I was handed over to the parliamentarian side, and he was put on trial. And he argued in his trial that the parliament and the court had no authority over him. He was the king. Parliament said, no, that's not right. We're in charge now, and we're going to put you on trial and force you to punish you for being a tyrant. And King Charles was very brave, and he faced down his adversaries in the court, but unfortunately they were in charge and they had him condemned to death. So King Charles I was brought out and he was executed. Now, many in the Church of England regard King Charles as being a martyr. There's a society, King Charles a Martyr, and until the 19th century, in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, there was a prayer to be said on the feast day of King Charles the Martyr on the 30th of January. Some churches still celebrate this, some don't. The cult of King Charles the Martyr as a saint, some Anglicans are into that and some aren't. The Anglo-Catholics, the High Church Anglicans, they tend to be more enthusiastic of the idea of King Charles as a martyr. If you're an Anglican who's very Calvinistic and you're more inclined towards a Puritan way of thinking, then you're probably not going to be terribly enthusiastic about the idea of King Charles as a saint. I'm a Roman Catholic. I have a certain soft spot for Anglicanism, and I celebrate the feast of King Charles the Martyr every year in January. He's not a Catholic saint, but I think he's a pretty good chap, and I like to honour him. So what happened after the execution of King Charles the First? Well, his son tried to carry on the fight. He raised up an army of Scots because, of course, Charles was a Scottish king, so there's still that loyalty to the Stuart dynasty. And Prince Charles, as we should call him, he brought this army of Scots, and they had a fight at Worcester, which was a royalist city, but they were defeated by the parliamentary side. And Charles and his younger brother James fled to France, where they were in exile. So then what happens next in the country? Who's going to be in charge once there's no king? So initially Parliament are in charge, and they've got big ideas. So one of the big ideas that Parliament had was to reform the Church of England and put into practice all these things that the Puritans wanted to do. So they came up with, they got a committee together who came up with the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was a statement of doctrine, a bit like the 39 Articles of the Church of England, but expressing Calvinistic views, expressing the Reformed way of thinking. And that document, it was hugely important to Reformed churches. If you're in a Presbyterian church like the Church of Scotland or the Free Church of Scotland, or one of the American denominations like the Presbyterian Church in America or the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, then that that doctrinal guideline in the Westminster Confession of Faith will be hugely important to your faith and practice. If you want to be a minister in a Presbyterian church, you have to conform to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and if there's anything you disagree with, you have to explain why. But in England, that was a failure. The reason being that although Parliament was very much supportive of Presbyterianism and making these reforms to the Church of England, a chap called Oliver Cromwell had different ideas. So Oliver Cromwell was a member of Parliament who became a general within the parliamentary army. He established what was called a new model army, a new way of organising the army, which was very effective in the English Civil War, and he was regarded as a hero and the top guy after the defeat of the king. And initially, he wanted to work with Parliament and give them the space to make all the reforms that they wanted to make, but he couldn't get on with them. One of the reasons for that being that Oliver Cromwell was not a supporter of Presbyterianism. As I said in the last video, there were three groups within the Puritans. There were those who were the moderates, who wanted to work with the monarchy and to keep the bishops, but to make some small changes. There were those who supported Presbyterianism and who wanted to follow the lead of Scotland and have a Presbyterian church governed by elders with no bishops. And that was what Parliament wanted. But there was another group who were independents or Congregationalists. They wanted independent congregations for the congregation to be able to make their own decisions about how they ran things. And that was the view of Oliver Cromwell. And some of those independents became Baptists. They started to adopt the practice of baptizing believers rather than babies or children. So Oliver Cromwell, he wasn't enthusiastic about the idea of turning the Church of England into a Presbyterian body. He wanted religious freedom. He wanted all the sects to be tolerated. He wanted independent congregations for individual churches to take their own lead on how they governed themselves. And so he didn't see eye to eye with Parliament. And eventually he closed down Parliament and put a big sign on the door saying, "This house to let." And so he ruled as a dictator. Under Oliver Cromwell, England became a dictatorship. He gave himself the title of Lord Protector. He was king in all but name. And there was a lot of tolerance extended to various churches during the period of what's called the Commonwealth. Not to be confused with the modern organisation called the Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth of England and Wales. That was a kind of alternative to being a kingdom, being the Commonwealth. So, and all manner of Protestant denominations were tolerated. Roman Catholics weren't tolerated, and Oliver Cromwell is famous for extending some quite harsh treatment to Catholics in Ireland who rebelled against his regime. And the Book of Common Prayer, the prayer book of the Church of England, that was made illegal, so you weren't allowed to be an Anglican. So some of the what actually happened to the Church of England during that time then? Did it just disappear? Well, the bishops were abolished, so there's no longer an episcopate. The Book of Common Prayer is probably used in secret and where people get away with using it. Some ministers who didn't agree with Puritanism probably did their best to carry on with things as they were within what was tolerated. And then others probably went along with the Puritan way of doing things. Some parish churches probably appointed a Puritan minister who and became pretty much like congregational churches or Presbyterian churches. But it was a chaotic time, and people didn't like the harsh rule. There were a lot of laws brought in to govern what people could and couldn't do. The theatres were closed because they were seen as a source of immorality. Christmas was not allowed. You couldn't celebrate Christmas because that was thought of as being popish. When Oliver Cromwell died, his son Richard took over, Richard Cromwell, but he was completely useless and he pretty much gave up on the job. So then power went over to the army and the generals. And one of the generals, General Monk, invited Charles II to come back and be king. He thought, well, things just aren't working. I think we need a king again. And so King Charles II returned to England. He extended forgiveness to a lot of the people who'd supported Parliament, but not to the people who'd signed the death warrant for King Charles I. Those people were hung, drawn and quartered. They were executed. King Charles II, he'd lived in France for a good chunk of his life, and he was very sympathetic to Catholicism. His brother James II, well, the future James II, converted to Catholicism. Charles II, he converted on his deathbed, but he remained a Protestant for most of his life. But he had those sympathies for Catholicism. His wife was a Catholic. So basically, during his reign, the Church of England went back to how it was before. The bishops were restored. The Book of Common Prayer was restored. In fact, we've got a new edition of the Book of Common Prayer, the 1662 edition, which is effectively the definitive edition of the Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican Prayer Book. So the Prayer Book Society in Britain today, the prayer book that they promote is the Book of Common Prayer 1662. There was an attempt to reform the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. We'll mention that later when we get to the 20th century. I don't think we're going to get that far in this video. But that was rejected by Parliament. So 1662 has remained the definitive edition of the Book of Common Prayer. Obviously, in America, the Episcopal Church and the Anglican bodies that have succeeded from that, they've got their own editions of the Book of Common Prayer. For instance, the 1928 Book of Common Prayer and the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. But they're big revisions with those. The modern liturgies that the Anglican Church has used since then, the Alternative Service Book in the 1980s, and then at the turn of the century, the Common Worship series of books, and there's an awful lot of them. These are modern liturgies, and though you can see the influence of the Book of Common Prayer on the modern liturgies of the Anglican Church, they are quite different. So there are churches you can go to, Church of England parishes, where they will still use the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. Thankfully, there's still quite a lot of them, and possibly they're increasing. The Prayer Book Society, which supports the Book of Common Prayer, has been a huge force in supporting prayer book parishes and encouraging the continued use in the Book of Common Prayer. The 1662 book, as I mentioned, had a collect for the feast of King Charles Martyr, and also a feast for bonfire night, when they remember the defeat of the people who tried to kill the king at a bonfire night. But those were removed in the 19th century, so they're still the same edition. That bit's been trimmed out. Not quite sure why. King Charles II, so he was in some ways a bit of a hedonist. He had lots of mistresses and he had lots of illegitimate children by them, but he was a good chap, and he was particularly interested in science. I think I mentioned earlier the Royal Society was founded during the reign of Charles II, and it promoted scientific exploration and experimentation. There were social changes, for instance, the introduction in that period of tea and coffee. Coffee houses started to found where well-to-do men would get together and they would discuss all sorts of different topics. So King Charles II, he died just before converting to Catholicism on his deathbed, and he was succeeded by his younger brother, James II. Now, James II had been with Charles when they were both in exile in France, and as a result of that influence, James had converted to Catholicism. He was a Roman Catholic. However, by his first wife, he had two daughters, Mary and Anne, who were both Protestants. They'd been brought up as Protestants before he converted to Catholicism, and they were quite happy to stick with that. So although people were quite alarmed at having a Catholic king, they weren't too worried about it, because they could be confident that when James II died, that the throne would go to his Protestant daughters. Yeah. And one of the things that emerged during this period was political parties, because it was quite a talked about thing, obviously, having a Catholic king. So there were two political parties forming. There were the Whigs, who were very, very strong in their Protestantism. They were strong supporters of Parliament. They were very alarmed at having a Catholic king, and they were looking for an opportunity to get rid of him. Although obviously they didn't want another English civil war. The civil war was quite enough. And eventually the Whig Party would become the Liberal Party in the 19th century, the ancestors of our Liberal Democrat Party. Obviously, the Labour Party came in much later. That's a much later development with the advent of socialism in the 20th century. But we won't talk about that now. So you had the Whig Party, but you also had the Tories. Now, the Tories, they got their name from Irish bandits, Catholic bandits in Ireland. It was an insult, Tory. We still use the name Tory to refer to people in the Conservative Party. But the Tories in the 17th century, they were quite different to today's Conservative Party. And their main emphasis was on the importance of the king and the importance of the Church of England. So they believed in the king, they believed in the Church of England, and they didn't particularly like James's Catholicism, but they weren't too worried about it, because you had Parliament, you had the Church of England was established. They were quite happy to carry on working with the king. And the Tories were very much associated with the High Church party within the Church of England. So there was a political side of them which supported the monarchy, and there was the religious side of them, the High Church party that was emerging in the Church of England, who emphasised tradition, who emphasised the importance of the bishops, who emphasised the role of the monarch as the sacred head of the Church of England. And they would enter into controversy with the Whigs and those who were maybe a bit more hard-line in their Protestantism. Now, this state of affairs of James with his heirs being Mary and Anne, that came into a bit of a crisis when the King James decided to marry a new wife, who was Mary of Modena, a princess from Italy who was related to the royal family of France. She was a fervent Catholic. She came into this country, and she had a son. There were some conspiracy theories about how it wasn't really James' son, that it was some baby that was smuggled into the bedchamber, but that was a load of nonsense, really. But this son, James, who was born to Mary of Modena by James II, this created a crisis, because now there was a possibility that there might be a Catholic heir to James. There might be a new dynasty of Catholic monarchs, and that was the last thing that people wanted in Protestant England. So what happens next? Well, Mary, the the daughter of James, she is married to the King of the Netherlands, William of Orange. And William of Orange, he turns up on our shores with his army beside him, and James II has a right panic. He thinks, "Oh goodness me, they're rebelling against me," and he runs away, flees to the continent. He flees to France, where he knows he can be safe. He was in exile in France after the English Civil War, so he goes back to exile in France. And so what happens? There was a possibility of Mary becoming queen, but William of Orange was a little bit uncomfortable about that. He didn't want to be a sort of gentleman's servant, as he put it. So they came to an arrangement where William and Mary, Mary, of course, being the rightful monarch in the absence of King James and his heirs, and William as co-ruler. So we talk about William and Mary as being one single monarch because they shared the throne between them. Normally when a woman becomes queen in England, her husband, like Prince Philip for Queen Elizabeth, is just a sort of accessory, a gentleman's servant, as William was afraid to be. But here you had William and Mary co-reigning as king and queen. And people were kind of okay with that. One of the things that happened was a Bill of Rights was passed, which codified to some extent the Constitution of England and the power of the monarch and the importance of the necessity of Parliament passing any laws and raising any taxes. Scotland was allowed to keep their Presbyterian way of doing things. William and Mary agreed not to impose Anglicanism on the Scottish people, because of course Queen Mary was Queen of Scotland, because she was a Stuart. But these disputes between Tories and Whigs and High Church and Low Church, they carry on. Because, of course, a lot of the Tories, the people who supported the king, were a little bit uncomfortable about this. They thought, well, James II is technically still the rightful king of England. Some of them tried to justify it by arguing, well, James II has fled the throne and taken his heir with him, so effectively the throne's vacant. So there's no real objection to Mary and William becoming monarchs. It was a kind of de facto acceptance of the state of affairs that was there. But there were some within the Church of England on the High Church side who were a bit uncomfortable with this, to the extent that they weren't able to carry on within the Church of England, and so there was a succession. What are called the non-jurors, those who didn't regard William and Mary as being the rightful sovereigns, they left the Church of England and they carried on outside it, and they started to move in something of a less Protestant direction. They had some contact with Eastern Orthodox bishops and had some ideas about maybe reuniting with the Eastern Church. But that didn't come to any fruition. They were a little bit too grounded in their Protestantism and in their Western ways of doing things to be able to become Eastern Orthodox. But that's a whole nother topic in itself. It is possible to imagine that we might have had a kind of successor church to the Church of England, a kind of schismatic group, but none of the non-juror bishops who'd left the Church of England appointed successors. So once all the non-jurors had died off, there was no continuation of that schism. But it is quite interesting to think about what might have happened had that been more of a substantial movement. So we then come on. So Mary dies. William III becomes king in his own right. He dies. Queen Anne succeeds William, and she's the last of the Stuart dynasty. Queen Queen Anne, she never had any children herself, so the Stuart dynasty ends with her. And there's a certain sadness about that because there's something. I have a soft spot for the Stuarts. So who becomes king then? Well, they were determined to make sure that there was no Catholic succession. So they looked at various people who were descended from James I. As I said, all our royal families descended from Henry VII down to James I and his descendants. So there was Sophie of Hanover had been recognised by Parliament as being the successor to Anne, because she was descended from James I. Quite a remote succession. She died before Anne died, and so the throne passed to her son George, and so we get the George dynasty, and they lasted a whole four of them: George I, George II, George III, George IV, and finally a William IV after George IV. So we're kind of entering into the 18th century, and this is a time of increased modernisation, changes in agriculture, some hints of the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, but that doesn't really happen until the 19th century. But a lot of the groundwork for that in terms of changes in agriculture, changes in urbanisation start to occur within the 18th century. We get parties within the Church of England who are a little bit more liberal, a bit more rationalistic. There's a group called the Cambridge Platonists who emerged in the 18th century who they wanted moderation in religion. They didn't want things to be too Protestant. They didn't want things to be too traditionalist. They wanted to kind of stick to things that are kind of in the middle, no extremes. They weren't like the liberals in the 19th century who questioned the authority of the Bible, who questioned the reality of miracles. But they wanted to avoid enthusiasm. They wanted to avoid any radical ideas. And they were opposed by the High Church party, who wanted to emphasise the authority of the Church and the traditions of the Church of England. But by and large, if you went to any parish in the Church of England, things would largely look the same. So all of them used the Book of Common Prayer. They all used the same liturgy. The only real difference might be hints of theology in the sermon. But a lot of the priests in the Church of England didn't necessarily preach their own sermons. In a way, what you had emerging within the Church of England is a kind of upper-class, gentrified clergy. So the most of the vicars, most of the priests within the Church of England, or rectors, were appointed by the local landowner, the local gentry. And it was kind of a cushy, comfortable living because you got a job for life if you became an Anglican clergyman. And the younger sons of nobility, the younger sons of landowners often went into the church because they knew they had a job for life. And a lot of those people who went into that line of work weren't terribly spiritual or devoted or dedicated to the role, and so they would pretty much spend all their time hunting or socialising, going to the coffee houses, playing sports. Maybe they might have particular interests. So some clergymen were very enthusiastic about science, and they would put together huge, fantastic collections of butterflies that they found, or beetles. And a lot of scientific advances were done by kind of clergymen, vicars, who didn't really have that much interest in doing their job. And we owe quite a lot in terms of scientific development. A lot of the categorization in biology was developed by these amateur researchers who were Anglican priests. But unfortunately, this kind of lazy, disinterested clergy weren't necessarily helping the spiritual life of England. So a lot of people within the parishes of the Church of England were very ignorant. They didn't know an awful lot about the Word of God. They didn't know an awful lot about what they were supposed to believe. They went to church every Sunday, but they were either given sermons by a priest who didn't really care that much, possibly, who was more interested in going fishing or hunting, or they might be given sermons by a curate, somebody who was preparing to get their own living, or they might get sermons by a lecturer who'd been paid to deliver them, who might not necessarily be all that well educated. So there's a huge level of ignorance within the Church of England, within England, about spiritual things. So this was a time of what you might say is spiritual deadness. And this is where we get on to the evangelical revival within the Church of England. I don't think we've got time to really talk about this within this video, because it's such a huge topic. So we'll leave it here for now. So we've talked about the Stuarts, we've talked about the English Civil War, we've talked about the rise and fall of the Puritan party. I've probably skipped over huge amounts of important stuff, but if there's anything that I should have mentioned, I'll try and remember to mention it in the next video. So we're going on to the evangelical revival in the next video. So stay tuned, chaps and chapesses. Thank you for listening to me.